Welcome to the Lights Camera Pro podcast, where we interview entertainment pros about their careers and how they became successful in the industry. The secrets to their success here every week. Here's your host, Shawn Ventura.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Lights Camera Pro podcast. I'm your host, Shawn Ventura, and I just want to say subscribe on Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you are. Leave a good review, tell your friends, share on social media. Thanks. So today our guest is Jon Dilling, good friend of mine. He is a promo and long-form television editor. He's got lots of stories about being an editor in TV. Here we go.
Hey, Jon, thanks for doing this. This is awesome.
My pleasure. Yeah.
I used to stop by your room all the time on the fourth floor and sit and chat. And we've played golf several times. So we've known each other for many, many years. And so how did you get into this industry, and how did you know you wanted to work in TV?
How did I know? I don't know. Certainty is not a forte for me. So I'm not even sure still after doing this for 25 years if I'm doing the right thing. But, I think that, that uncertainty or that, openness to lots of things, I think helps along the way. I think, for me, I first remember doing this stuff when I was in high school or even before then. My church, it was a bit, I went to church as a kid and they had a big sound system and I would run the sound system. One of the guys running that was an older guy that let me run the audio board. And I remember being really fascinated by that. And they would, record the Sunday meeting and then hand it out for people that couldn't be there or whatever.
Right.
And so like entry into media that way. And, being given I remember being given responsibility from an early age. And I look back now and I marvel at some of that, like that people would hand me something that they really, felt strong about and was like, oh, here's a kid, but he's taking it seriously. So I think really early on, I learned it. If you took things seriously when it came to this stuff, that you were given responsibility sort of according to the level that, you were, committed to it.
Right.
And that was like recording, it turned into like recording weddings and things like that. And then even my high school at that time had a radio station and a TV studio, which was kind of odd. It's a college town, but it was a rural community in Indiana. Lafayette, okay. Lafayette, Indiana. Purdue University is there. So there was a lot of technology, but it was all like engineering. It was like an engineering ag school.
Okay.
But I don't, I didn't like school a lot. And I don't know. I think that helped because, when it came to, there's a lot to doing this stuff like film and TV and radio. There's a lot of little things. It's not that I didn't like learning. I think I didn't like the what do you call it? It was just mundane, it was repetitive and kind of boring. And
right.
So, media, it's like, hey, here's in high school, I could take a class where it's like, hey, you get a credit hour for running a DJ shift at the radio station. It was a broadcast radio station. It was low wattage. You could only pick it up in town, but definitely if you're driving around town and turned on 91.9 FM, you'd be listening to high school kids from my high school and still do. I mean,
right. So did you have a DJ name? Because I did a DJ in college and my name was Wee Wee Bongo.
I love that.
Yeah. Wee Wee Bongo.
No, I wasn't nearly that cool. There were a couple cool kids like Tony Molaskey, I think was this guy's name. And he knew all the cool songs and stuff to play. I was kind of square, I really sort of late developer when it came to like, I look back now on 80s music and I'm like, how did I miss all that then? And I think finally when like High Fidelity and School of Rock came out, my appreciation for the music of my time sort of blossomed maybe 1 or 2 decades too late.
Right.
I do love that music. And I wish I had been more plugged into it at the time. But I did always like the mechanics of it, like the handling the gear and how it worked. I didn't necessarily want to take it apart, like some guys, like the engineer,
Right.
the kids that ended up going to Purdue would build their own radios. I never really wanted to do that,
Right.
but I did like knowing like what all the knobs and dials did.
And did you have did you have those track things that you inserted? We're about the same age. You know what I'm talking about?
Cart
Carts.
machines.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
when we were at Emerson,
this thing had,
we were in the, you had to put on Led Zeppelin if you wanted to go to the bathroom because it was like an 8-minute song, Stairway to Heaven, because you're the only person there late at night, right?
Right.
So you had to put the card in. You're like, okay, I got 7 minutes and 40 seconds. I got to run down the hallway.
Yeah. And I think
remember
early
those carts.
DJs, they would call them like smoke break songs or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever song gave you enough time to do that. Yeah. And to like, I remember if you wanted to record over those, we had this giant magnet. You would set the card on it and activate the magnet.
Yes, I remember
and just
that.
rub it around. And that would, I guess, effectively erase the tape and you could record something new on it.
Exactly.
Yeah, college was pretty college was great. I don't know that there was any kind of standout moments in college where I felt really confident that, I'm going to be an editor. At that time, editing was just such a small part of what I was learning. And then toward the end of college, you have to start thinking about what you're going to do for a career, right?
Right.
And the way you were always told was like, you got to go find an internship somewhere. And I had done I'd done a couple live events. I think when you're young, the idea of like travel is exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And, I knew live sports was an option and I could maybe be a cameraman or a technical director or even a director for live sports. Like that seemed like a really exciting thing to do. And then I got a chance to work on some like, I don't know, really low level NCAA wrestling thing. And I had to carry a camera on my shoulder, like do handheld,
right.
And it was heavy and I'm not a strong guy. And I was getting yelled at because I couldn't keep focus. And again, it was, live events, like live news, is a demanding environment. Like if you're missing it, you're missing it. And the people in those situations they run pretty hot, and you got to be pretty tough to survive it. And I think after a couple of those, I realized that was probably not for me. And then somehow I found out about post-production. I didn't know about it, but I got an internship at this place in Charlotte, North Carolina. And they did sports marketing, and it was really born out of a sports marketing company, but they had all this post equipment and they were trying to expand their business. So they did corporate videos, and they even did advertising agencies, some regional stuff. But they had like film transfer, and they had some really nice high-end production gear, post-production gear. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll go give that a shot.
Right.
And yeah, so that's when I really started to learn about real post-production, what that was like, computer-based, computer-controlled tape machines and time code and color bars and all that stuff.
And sorry, what was the name of this place? It was in Charlotte?
So this place, no longer there. It was, at the time, it was called Creative Post and Transfer, which is probably the least creative name you could get. I mean, there are probably 100 of those across the country,
exactly.
Right? Yeah. Creative Post.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Creative Post where? Yeah. But
Charlotte's nice though.
It is nice. It was a nice town.
Yeah. Right by the water.
Yep. And that was another thing. Like, so you're coming out of college and you're thinking, I'm going to make a career of this. Immediately your thoughts go, Los Angeles is one, and New York would be another big obvious one. And for kids from the Midwest, Chicago is actually considered, sort of a third in that. Although I think mostly outside the Midwest, nobody thinks about going to Chicago to launch their career.
Right. And so what were you doing there?
again, you start off like doing, I was assistant editing.
Dubs,
so I was doing Chiron, dubs, things like that. But that was where I first encountered Avid. It was really emerging then. I moved there in like 91, I think. Yep. And yeah, sort of right when Avid was really starting to get out there, and nobody knew what it was. Like they bought one. I think they had the only one in Charlotte, and they're like, "Hey, college kid, like go figure out what that thing does." Yeah. And I was like, "Okay." And there wasn't a lot of, there was a lot of curiosity around it. I don't think there was a lot of respect for it. Like you couldn't load a lot of material on it. So everybody, the older guard, the guys I really looked up to, immediately started, well, what can you do on that? You know, the video looks like crap. You can't only load an hour worth of footage and then you got to delete it all. You know, there was a lot of poo-pooing what the limitations of the system were, but at the same time, the people that owned the facility were like, I think this is the future. And by learning it, and this is a really compressed time for me. So out of college, I go to Charlotte. I'm there for, I forget when we actually bought the Avid, but less than a year that I'm there, they bought the Avid. I learned the Avid. Immediately, like there was an agency film director, really talented guy named Mark Claywell. And he wanted to play with this thing. And so I was the only one in the building that knew how to run it. So I'm immediately working with this pretty talented agency director, which is insane that I was allowed that access. But the technology is what opened that up for me. So Mark's in there playing with me and he loves it. He just loves the creativity, and his mind immediately got what was possible. And there are spots on I shared my blog with you. There are spots I did in there from 92, and I look at it, I had no idea what I was doing. Mark just made me do that stuff. Right. And I was like learning on the fly. I was like, well, this guy knows what he's doing. He didn't know the computer, but I do. And I'm just learning from him as we go. And then because I had the online background, because I was assisting in there, at that time, it was the standard workflow was, well, after you finished Avid, you had to go to a finishing room because, you had to get back to the full resolution. Right. And Mark had developed a rapport with me at that point where it's like, hey, kid, you can finish this, right? And I was like, yeah, I could. He's like, I want you to finish it. And I'm like, oh, my God. So now, like, I'm this guy's like start to finish editor guy. And it was the beginning of what eventually, the next many years of my career turned into that, where it was like, wow, if you had skills both in an online finishing room and with Avid, doors just flew open for you. Right.
How old were you?
I was 25, maybe. I mean, I was right out of college. I wasn't even that. I mean, I was probably like 23, 24 doing this stuff.
Right. Yeah, I was about the same age. And I saw the possibilities right away because I had worked at this Russian TV station in New York where they were doing beta to beta editing. And literally I had no idea how to run the beta to beta, whatever they called it. And I went in there and they were like, okay, well, now we have to start over because we want to put another clip at the beginning. And I said, what? Yeah. Who designed this? This is stupid. We just did 3 minutes of editing. So for me, Avid was like, oh, you don't have to do that. Because I did not like that you had to go back and start over if you wanted to put something in the beginning.
People got really creative in those days. Like they would do what were called A/B rolls. Like and so you'd lay a music track on 2 bits of tape, right? And then you would edit to a music track. And then when you wanted to do a fancy transition and online, you'd take in both the tapes and you'd sync them up. And to this day, I don't think I ever was able to set up an A/B roll thing because it was just so bizarre to me. But people, I think it speaks to creative people's ingenuity to work with what they had. Right. And it's not surprising how quickly they abandoned that for what you and I had early access to.
Right. But the film cutting didn't make sense. The tape to tape didn't make sense to me at all. But then as soon as I saw the Avid, I was like, oh, this makes sense.
Yeah.
It's the first time I had an editing program that made sense to me.
Yeah.
So where do you go from there?
So within a few years of doing sort of spec spots, really was all I was doing with Avid at that time in Charlotte. I put together a few spec spots, I'm trying to think. I think I actually did a couple legitimate jobs with Mark. And then, I had half a dozen spots to put on a reel, and a lot of the more talented guys at the place that I was at in Charlotte were like, look, you need to go to a bigger market. And that's how the business worked, right? It was like, if you wanted to move up, you needed to move out. Yep. And that's how you advance. So I set my sights on the next big market, which was Atlanta. Again, it was sort of a safe step up. And I got in touch, people put me in touch with people here in Atlanta at another small post house called Magic Lantern.
Yes.
Yep. So that place was great. So I went in there as a guy that had both skills, right? You can do Avid, you could do online. What they really wanted me though was more I did about 70 or 80% online work and just a little bit of Avid work.
Okay.
Because these guys were more
effects?
Not more effects. They were more agency sort of craft storytelling kind of spots, right? And agency work in Atlanta in those days was actually pretty decent. I mean, this was back when big agencies like BBDO and Tucker Wayne Lucky, and they were doing Bell South at the time, and Delta and Coke, and a lot of that stuff was being done here in Atlanta. And it fed, even if you weren't doing the national spots, which occasionally you might get some crumbs for that stuff,
right?
It just fed the whole market. There was tons of agency stuff going on. And so little places like Magic Lantern thrived. And it was a good exposure for me to a much more sophisticated advertising scene than was in Charlotte. And then, of course, my introduction to broadcast working with Turner. My first Turner clients came when I was at Magic Lantern.
Okay.
And that was the first time that I really started developing relationships with creative folks. I mean, Mark was an early guy and he gave me a huge break. And once I left Charlotte, I would only see him occasionally. I still see him on Facebook, but I never really worked with him after that.
Right.
But I understood from Charlotte how important that relationship with a director, with a producer, with a writer was, and how almost more important than your skills at editing or the craft were your relationship skills with the people that brought you the work. And that really blossomed for me at Magic Lantern, like learning how important, because now instead of just being an assistant editor where you are considered liability to the company, right? You're not, you're a line item on the expense sheet. People aren't coming to work with the assistant. Yeah, they're coming to work with the editor.
Right.
And so when your room is billing $300 an hour, whatever it's billing, they're billing it for the guy running the show. And so this is my first time being in that seat, and wow, a lot of pressure. I'm not even 30 yet. I'm probably 25, 6 or something like that. And being handed the keys to a room and expected to bill, full-time work as much as I can in a room that's going for $300 an hour and getting paid probably 30 grand,
Right.
And thrilled, it's like, I was doing freaking cartwheels when I got that first editing gig. I couldn't believe it.
You were probably 10 years ahead of where you should have been. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I think not knowing any better, like there were moments when like you're young and stupid and you don't realize how over your head you are. And that was fine. And in some ways it was good because I didn't worry about like I was only making 30 grand and the company was making tens of thousands of dollars off of me. I didn't care. I was like, it was the most money I'd ever made in my life. And I was doing something I really loved doing. The whole cartoon thing is interesting. I don't know how I landed there. And I think it was really just an organic process of.
But were you at Cartoon before Harvey?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. I was doing promos. We did, before Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law was one of the first shows that came out when Adult Swim launched.
Right. So
leading up to Adult Swim, we would do promotions and then they're like, oh, we're going to do this adult block. And nobody knew what Adult Swim was.
Right.
And I worked with Matt Pacino, the producer who did the initial packaging for the whole Adult Swim thing. And even at the time, I didn't understand what it was. I just thought, oh, it's this like, we would do stunts for various things. So it's like, oh, this is just a couple hours, during the night that they're dedicating to a certain kind of cartoons, and we'll just promote it that way. And then, Harvey had already started production. So I knew the guys behind it, Michael Lean and Eric Richter. Michael was a creative director at the time and Eric was a writer. I'd worked with both of them on various projects. And so I knew them and I knew when they were doing Harvey that it was happening, but it was a very painful start for that show. Like everything about Adult Swim is not done traditionally.
Right.
And they celebrate that. There is good and bad to it. I will say that. But the Harvey show, I think they started and stopped with 2 or 3 different production companies before they got past the second episode. So the pilot for Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, was done with J.J. Settlemeyer, and he's a really famous, really well-respected animation guy. And I don't know if they ever intended to do the full series with him or not. That's actually a good question. I don't know the answer to, but by the time they were planning it out and it looks very different than the rest of the shows if you ever see the pilot.
Right.
But by the time they were ready to go to series with they had started with an animation company that it didn't work out. And it was just this really, it was just a shit show. I remember they were trying to get the second episode. The second episode they had to finish by January 30 or January 1 of whatever year that was. Probably 2000 or 2001.
And let me just ask you, was Mike, is it Lazo or Lazo? Was he involved at all, or was
he involved with
Turner involved at all? Did he come by?
No,
and look
not
at
Ted.
Stuff,
I mean, this is really Lazo. Lazo sort of gave birth to the whole block of Adult Swim.
Okay.
And he wasn't in the nuts and bolts, like he wasn't in the edit sessions,
more big picture.
More big picture, show development, curating the shows, choosing what went on there. So I never, even though I always knew who Mike was, I never interacted with Mike directly.
Okay.
And Mike would watch our stuff and, give comments and feedback and help steer the direction of the show. But by the time the guys got to the first couple of shows, I think we only had so much animation. We did what were called cheater shows. And usually you do a cheater show after a season or two, right? Where you just go back and cherry pick highlights from, the best of the stuff that you've got so far. We were doing a cheater show on like show 4, It was like, well, we've got this animation. Can we retime it and repurpose it and make a whole new episode out of the like 10 minutes of stuff we've already got? Right. And it's like, okay, let's go for it. And we did a couple like that. But as we were putting those together, they were like, we need to build an animation studio here. And they did that. They hired in a bunch of guys, really talented guy, Rich Ferguson Hall, came in to direct the whole operation, and a whole team of animators at Turner Studios. Right. And for the next several years, we would, my role as an editor would basically to put together they would record a radio play of the script, and then they would storyboard to the radio play.
Right.
And so they would see what the animation would kind of look like. But then we would come into edit and fine tune that before it went to edit. So we would look at timing and shot blocking and pacing,
Right.
and even working out jokes, because the guys notoriously overwrite for the show.
Right.
So for an 11-minute show, we'd have like 15 minutes of storyboard. And it's like, well, where are we going to cut 3 minutes of this?
Right.
So then that's the first stage of the editing of the show. And then it goes off to animation. Like once we get the animatic down to a pretty close to showtime, in this case, a quarter-hour show. In the show I'm on now, it's, you just try to get the board as close to showtime as you can.
Right.
And then it goes off to animation. I don't see it again for months because people are hand drawing that stuff.
Right.
And then it comes back and the guys along the way are looking at scene by scene. It's like, oh, scene 4's done, scene 13's done. And they're approving animation, but not until it comes back into edit and we stitch it all together are they able to see the whole thing finally animated.
Right.
And then we usually spend several more days or weeks, whatever we're allowed to, putting together the final animation and tweaking it before the show's done.
So much work, man. And how long did you work on that? Was that 7-8 years?
So we did, I'd have to check I think it was, I think we did like 40 episodes, and I think it took, probably about 6 years to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then you do that, and then for the next several years, you're working on promos or something?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So you went to promos from TV shows.
Yeah, and I was doing promos the whole time. I mean,
Right.
the bulk of what we do where I work is promote acquired series.
Right.
There's not a ton of content in the way that people think of content being generated there. People like to say there is, but
Well, they have
really,
the cartoon studios in LA that makes some stuff, right?
yeah, oh yeah, that's where the originals are
Yeah.
made. So yeah, and that's where the shows, not the Adult Swim shows, but that's where a lot of the kid
cartoon
shows, like Adventure Time and Regular Show and those shows. Yeah.
So this is horrible, just summing up the next 10 years. And promo, I mean, you can talk about it as long as you want, but we don't have 30 minutes to talk.
Yeah. I mean, promo work, it's really interesting for me. I mean, there was a time where I bristled at the notion, and you kind of alluded to it earlier. It's like, you can do more than just promos. And of course you can. And I was sitting on a panel back at Indiana University several years ago, and I'm on a panel with a bunch of other industry people talking to college kids about what it's like in the business.
Right.
And the moderator, she doesn't know me. And she's like, oh, well, and you do, what is it, the kind of work you do? And I tell her, she's like, oh, you're a short form guy. And I remember my immediate reaction was just super defensive and anger. Like, how dare you call me a short form guy? But
Right.
particularly in the context, it made perfect sense. And she was absolutely right. It is I have now sort of come to relax about that and acknowledge that, it's for the most part, short form editing it's a very, it's a particular style of editing, and doing the show work has really informed my work in promos and short form, because God, I mean, if running a marathon, making a show is running a marathon, to be sure, and making promos is sprinting. And somewhere along the way, you have to decide, am I a marathon guy or am I a sprinter? And most people don't like both, and if you realize, hey, I'm pretty good at the sprints and I like it. I like the turnover. I like there is doing promo work. It's very different because as an editor, I think you're given a ton more creative input than you get doing show work. Show work is it's a big machine. There's a lot of moving parts, and people get really specialized out of necessity. And promos, because they're short and don't have a lot of money, that necessity is, well, one person's got to make a lot of stuff happen. And there is a lot of satisfaction for somebody who's good at that. Like if you're good at mixing music and sound effects and a little bit of graphics and storytelling, editing and all of that, then you're probably a good promo person. You know, if you're into watching hours and hours of footage or spending like lots of time discussing plot twists or the motivation behind why a character would say or do a particular thing, that's show editing. And you know, if you're ADD, you're going to be a promo guy. If you're able to read War and Peace, you're probably better suited for show editing.
Cool. So, so many interesting stories, so much cool stuff. Last thing I want you to talk about, and I don't know where this is going to go, but the Shaq Hall of Game stuff that you worked on. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one to pick. I mean, that happened a few years ago. Cartoon was doing this. I think Nickelodeon at the time had an awards show, and the people running Cartoon Network were like, we need an awards show. So they kind of, it's like, and that's how TV works, right? They've got it. We need it. So yeah, Hall of Game was this wacky thing. It was an awards show that Cartoon Network kind of cooked up. And yeah, it was interesting for me as somebody who works for Cartoon Network and for somebody who's watching, like I'm always kind of an insider or outsider. Like all my work is for Cartoon Network, but I work for a studio that provides work to Cartoon Network. So I've always had this sort of inside outsider view. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, why, like Hall of Game, it's a sports awards show, but they're using cartoons. I never really got my head around why they were doing it, other than I think they needed an awards show, and it was probably the fastest, easiest, most obvious way for them to do an awards show was to invent these awards and hand them out to celebrity athletes. And the people running Cartoon Network at the time loved to brush shoulders with celebrities. Right. And they threw a big party and gave out a bunch of awards, but and it had a big budget. It was a pretty impressive thing. And yeah, of course, Turner had access to Shaquille O'Neal. And Shaquille is always dabbling in all kinds of things. So of course he's up for it. Hey, Shaq, you want to do Hall of Game? Sure. Yeah, let's do Hall of Game. And I forget the director. We actually did Hall of Game for a few years.
But the spot I saw had like everything they were handing him was super small.
Okay.
Like the small coffee cup. And
yeah.
So that was funny, man. That was really funny.
Yeah. The director on that, Bruce Hurwitz, he was a really good friend of, and is a good friend of Mike O'Lean's. Bruce, and I've worked off and on with him. He's a super talented director. And I don't know if Bruce came up with the idea or it was a collaborative effort to come up with that idea. But yeah, anytime you're working with Shaq, it's sort of like, it's the elephant in the room. It's like, well, what do you do when you have Shaq? You do size jokes, right? Because he's so big. And so, yeah. So yeah, those were really fun spots to work on. Mm-hmm. I've worked on a few projects with him. And what I kind of noticed about him was, I think he's very self-aware about what he's good at doing. And so if you sort of concoct a situation for Shaq to be in, and it's not what he's good at, he's going to find a way to take it to where he's good in it. And I think people fight with him on that. And I think that's where that sort of difficult to work with thing comes from. But on the editing side, when I see what comes back and you look at what he gives you that is usable, I'm like, oh my God, it's gold. Mm-hmm. It's not what they asked him to do at all. Well, maybe a little bit.
Right.
But he definitely knows and stays in his lane. And I have all the respect in the world for him.
There's a lot of physical comedy with Shaq. The falling and Pratt falling and knocking stuff over.
And he's just got that quality. He's got charisma, right? You see a lot of people, and I have so much, editors occasionally, we have to record our own voices, and you have to sort of play act. And I'm so bad at it. And there's nothing that gives me more respect for people on camera or on mic than to try to do it yourself. And I think that's another reason like people end up in editing or post-production is that realization that one, you're either afraid of doing it or you realize you're just not good at being on camera or in front of the camera. Yeah.
But let me ask you this, John. Let me ask you this, because this is kind of an interesting observation I had about you, because I've seen you edit a lot of cartoon. I've seen your spots. You showed me your blog with all your spots, and obviously, well, not obviously, but I believe you're a great editor. But at the same time, you went over and did some TCM spots, and this was 10 years ago, 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And I know you remember it, but I remember seeing the spots. I think you showed them to me, and I remember thinking, holy crap, this guy's really good. You know what I mean? And I hate to say that like a cartoon versus a TCM spot is different or whatever, but I could see it. I could really see it. And I just wanted you to comment on how that was different working on those spots.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say when I look back on my work, and thank you, by the way, for that. And one thing I always give a lot of credit for the stuff that I've enjoyed working on to the people I've worked with. Right. I mean, I've never once given birth to an idea. Like my whole identity in terms of what I do as an editor is to help other people realize their creative vision. So I always feel really honored when I get to work on something that does turn out really well. And you're right. I mean, it does. The editing brings a lot to that, but ultimately, it's the people I work with or get the pleasure to work with that I think really reflect how good those things come out in the end. And so, TCM as a network, when I was working with them, and still to this day, they put a lot of emphasis on, they want their stuff to look beautiful.
Right.
And so, yeah, when you're in that, when you're working on those projects, that's the task at hand. It's like, this needs to be beautiful. It's art. Like we're making art, and a lot of that is in service to, classic films. It's they're trying to elevate what they're doing to match the level of expectation behind the films that they're representing.
Awesome. So John, so many cool stories, so much, so interesting stuff here, but what kind of, if you can, it's fine. What kind of advice for people starting out that want to get into TV and editing and maybe work at Adult Swim? What kind of advice would you give them to get there?
Patience, is a big thing. Just you gotta stay patient. And the thing is, in my career, I had opportunities come at me really fast, and I was lucky enough to be ready for them in that moment. The thing is you can't fabricate the opportunity, right? The opportunity is either there or it's not. And so I think when I think about career development, where I try to advise people is you think about like two lines of your career. There's sort of like what you're capable of doing, and then that's one line. And that's always changing, right? It's sort of like a upward moving graph. Like you're right. Constantly learning, your abilities are growing or whatever. Then there's another line that's moving along, and it's the work that you're asked to do. And these lines both sort of zigzag as they go across the graph. And there are times when your ability and the job you're working for intersect in a perfect moment, but it's only about 4 or 5 times over the length of your career. Most of the time, you're either being asked to do work that's below your skill set, or you're in over your head. And so I think what you have to think about in career development is like, are you preparing yourself for the moments when you're going to be over your head? And are you able to be patient in the moments when you're being asked to do work below you? And if you can manage those two situations well, everything else just takes care of itself. The managing, I think it's probably easier to manage to keep yourself in check when you're doing work that's below you, because that's just settle down and do it. The tricky part is when you're over your head, and how do you manage that stuff? And you're never going to really advance in your career until you put yourself out there like that. So one, it's going to take personal courage. You got to be able to face that fear. You got to have some strategies for when it goes wrong too. Like, do you have people you can reach out to and help you get through there? Or do you have a bailout? I think one of the biggest scars I had early on, and this was like that first job at Magic, I was in way over my head and I took a session way off the rails. I wasted a lot of money and a lot of people's time. And I realized in the moment I needed to pull the plug a lot earlier than I did. And I learned from that. I mean, I was able to make, the company made it right for everybody, and I survived the moment. But to this day, I have scars from that. And I will always have scars from those moments. And there's not just that one moment, but learning from that and going, okay, the next time I'm in that situation, here's how I'm going to handle that, or here's how I would handle that. And so I think, those are and I know that's really broad. I think that for young people that are jumping into this, the landscape is so different from when, you and I were talking about tape and physical media, and the internet didn't even exist. And it's hard for me to think about specific, like, oh, learn this software or that software, because it's all going to change in a few years anyway. And who could have imagined being a podcaster when I came out of college, or being, a web video producer? Like, none of that existed. And I think it's the whole thing's going to keep evolving and changing. And so you look for those moments, and there's opportunities where you can capitalize or shine and, go for that stuff.
Yeah. And somebody told me that, I think it was someone, maybe John Lugering or someone in the studios, that sometimes you make mistakes, and you just have to own them.
Absolutely.
You can't deny it and say it wasn't my fault, someone else blame. And
you know what? I will tell you, if you do that correctly, that can almost, nobody wants you to screw up, but if you screw up and own it, that almost makes more of an impression than if you got it right and nobody noticed. It's like, wow, okay, they did screw it up. Okay, then you got to make it right. There has to be an amends for that. But if you do it in a professional way, that makes more of a statement, I think, than, oh, it was easy for that person, or they deflected. Boy, does that really stick with you if you get labeled as somebody that doesn't, like, I will never forget that when I run into people that don't take responsibility for their thing. That sticks hard. Yeah.
And I hate to add one more thing, but I'm going to. There's this thing where sometimes you just don't make air. And I remember 4 a.m. at Turner working on a show, Run It Back for Cartoon. And we're laying off a 26-minute show. And it's just not laying off, and it's airing at 8 a.m. And I'm sitting there with the producer, and they're really upset. And I'm like, listen, man, there's nothing I can do. There's no engineer here. Like, it's 4 a.m. This isn't going to make air. And then I just rebooted like 8-10 times, and it finally worked. And we got it over to BOC at 7:30 in the morning. But so it did make air. But there's just some times when, technical problems or tape or files or whatever just don't work. And
it's the hardest thing in the world too.
It's really hard.
And sometimes you got to be the face of it. They don't really care about the computer. You were the guy at the computer that failed. They're going to remember you,
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. So thanks so much, man. This has been awesome. I'm sure there's so many listeners who are totally going to enjoy this. And it was great hearing stories about how you started. I never knew. We never had that conversation. So
I think
thank you
for having me.
Yeah. And thanks so much for this.
Thanks, Shawn.
Awesome, man. Have a good one. Thank you so much. Talk to you later.
Thanks for listening to the Lights Camera Pro podcast, where entertainment pros talk about how they made their dream into a career.
Thanks for listening, and subscribe to our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. Thanks to Bob Juergens for the Rockin' VO and Joseph McDade for the music. Next time, we have a great guest. His name is Mark Kendall. He is a hilarious comedian. I've seen him live doing improv. He has also done a one-man show at the Alliance Theater. He's a writer, comedian, actor, teacher, so much more. We'll talk to him next time.